The insurance policy in my hands isn't worth $5 million. It's a death warrant. My husband's signature is forged, and my mother-in-law's voice just turned to ice. I'm holding the proof, but the hallway is too narrow to run. Her fingers dig into my arm, dragging me toward the bedroom where the treatment waits. The man I married is on the other side of that door, and he's not here to save me. The drawer groaned, resisting Sarah's tug until a final jerk sent a cascade of paperclips skittering across the hardwood. She ignored the mess, digging past tax returns and faded property deeds. Her fingers brushed a thick, cream-colored envelope tucked beneath a stack of dental records. The paper felt unnervingly heavy, embossed with the gold leaf of a firm she had never hired. She slid the document out. $5 million. The digits shimmered under the desk lamp, cold and precise. Her thumb traced the signature at the bottom, a jagged imitation of her own cursive, lacking the slight tilt she always gave the M. Her breath hitched, catching in a throat gone dry. Footsteps thudded in the hallway. David's laughter, low and rhythmic, harmonized with Eleanor's bright, melodic giggle. "Check the wine cellar, Dad," Eleanor shouted. "The 2012 vintage deserves a celebration." Sarah gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, her knuckles turning the color of bone. The policy listed them, husband and daughter, as the sole beneficiaries. No contingencies, no trusts, a clean sweep. The smell of roasting rosemary drifted from the kitchen, a scent meant for a family Sunday, now curdling in her nostrils. She shifted her weight, the floorboard beneath her heels creaking like a warning. Outside the frosted glass of the office door, two shadows merged into one. "Sarah, you coming down?" David's voice muffled through the wood. "The table is set." She stared at the forged ink until the letters blurred. He sounded patient. He sounded like a man with a plan. Sarah slid the policy into her waistband, the stiff paper biting into her skin, and smoothed her silk blouse over the secret. "Coming," she whispered to the empty room. She forced her face into a mask of domestic peace and turned the handle. The air in the hallway was thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and the lingering aroma of the rosemary chicken. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Every step toward the stairs felt like wading through deep water. She could hear the clink of silverware against china from the dining room below, a rhythmic domestic sound that now felt like the sharpening of knives. Eleanor was already seated at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes upward into a permanent, predatory squint. She was polishing a wine glass with a linen napkin, the rhythmic squeak-squeak of the cloth echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "There she is," Eleanor said, her voice a polished chime. "The lady of the house. You look pale, Sarah. Are you feeling that heaviness again?" Sarah forced a smile, her lips feeling like dry parchment. "Just a bit tired, Eleanor. The house is so large, sometimes the chores get ahead of me." David appeared from the kitchen, carrying a decanter of deep red wine. He moved with a grace that was almost liquid, his expensive silk shirt catching the light of the chandelier. He set the decanter down and stepped toward Sarah, his hands reaching for her waist. Sarah flinched internally, the forged insurance policy hidden against her skin feeling like a hot brand. "You work too hard, honey," David whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. His breath smelled of mint and something metallic. The wine, perhaps, or the cold logic of the document upstairs. "That's why we're going to the cabin this weekend. Just the three of us. No phones, no work. Just rest." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. Sarah saw the flicker of his knuckles. Snap, 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 as he cracked them in that rapid-fire sequence she had come to dread. Thumb, index, middle. The reset button, the prelude to a lie. "Rest sounds wonderful," Sarah managed to say, though her throat felt constricted, as if an invisible hand were tightening around her windpipe. She sat down, the mahogany chair feeling hard and unyielding. As David poured the wine, the liquid gurgling into the glasses like blood, Sarah's hand drifted to her pocket. Her thumb found the smooth, cool surface of the river stone. She began to rub it. 1, 2, 3. The meal proceeded in a blur of forced conversation. Eleanor spoke of the Miller family legacy, her voice a steady stream of purity and bloodlines, while David discussed the firm's recent successes. To any observer, they were the picture of American excellence. A wealthy family sharing a Sunday roast in a beautiful Lake Forest home. But Sarah could taste the bitterness in the back of her throat, a metallic tang that wasn't the wine. "Eat your peas, Sarah," Eleanor commanded gently, her eyes tracking every movement of Sarah's fork. "The nutrients will help with the tremors." Sarah looked down at her plate. The green spheres were perfectly aligned. She felt a wave of nausea. She knew now that the medicine Eleanor gave her, the supplements David insisted she take for her recovery from the accident, weren't meant to heal. They were meant to hollow her out from the inside. As the evening wore on, Sarah excused herself, claiming a headache. She needed to get back to the office to find more evidence. But as she stood, a wave of dizziness crashed over her. The room tilted. The chandelier above seemed to spin like a carousel of fire. "Let me help you, dear," Eleanor said, her hand clamping onto Sarah's arm with a strength that belied her age. Her fingers felt like iron bands. "You're so fragile lately. We really must get you to bed." Eleanor guided her toward the stairs, her touch clinical and cold. Sarah tried to pull away, but her legs felt like lead. As they passed the mahogany console in the hallway, Sarah's eyes caught a glimpse of a white envelope sitting in the mail tray. It was addressed to a private diagnostic lab in the city, the kind of place that didn't ask questions if the check was large enough. With a surge of desperation, Sarah stumbled, feigning a trip. As she went down, her hand swept across the console, snatching the envelope and tucking it into her sleeve. "Careful," Eleanor hissed, her voice losing its melodic sheen. She hauled Sarah upright, her face inches from Sarah's. The smell of industrial soap and lavender wafted from the older woman. "You're making a mess of yourself, Sarah. Go to your room, now." Sarah didn't argue. She scrambled up the stairs, her heart thudding in her ears like a heavy drum. She reached the master suite and bolted the door, the click of the lock providing a momentary illusion of safety. She slumped against the wood, gasping for air, the mailing envelope crinkling in her sleeve. She needed to call someone. She needed to get out. But as she reached for her nightstand, she realized her phone was gone. In its place was a glass of water and a single white pill. A heavy thud echoed from the other side of the door. Not a knock, a presence. "Sarah." David's voice was low, vibrating through the wood. "I know you're in there. I know you're worried. But Eleanor and I have talked." Sarah froze, her hand gripping the river stone in her pocket. Scritch, scritch, scritch. "We're moving up the trip," David continued, his tone chillingly calm. "We're leaving tonight. The mountain air will be good for you. It'll make everything quiet." Through the thin gap at the bottom of the door, Sarah saw the shadow of his feet. He wasn't leaving. He was waiting. Subverted beat 1.4. Sarah backed away from the door, her breath coming in ragged hitches. The master bathroom offered a second layer of defense, a sanctuary of cold marble and polished chrome. She ducked inside, turning the heavy brass deadbolt with a trembling hand. She needed to think. She needed a record. She pulled the mailing envelope from her sleeve, her eyes scanning the return address. Northwest Forensic Toxicology. Her heart leaped. If she could just get a message out or find what they were testing, she'd have the proof that would strip the accidental label from her deteriorating health. She heard muffled voices coming through the ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was a common quirk of the house's old ductwork. Sound traveled from the downstairs parlor straight to the master bath. She pressed her ear against the cold metal slats, her body shaking. "The dosage isn't working fast enough, Eleanor." David's voice drifted up, stripped of its usual warmth. It sounded like grinding stones. She was snooping in the office. She's starting to put the pieces together. I saw her face when she looked at the policy. "I told you we should have used the digitalis from the start," Eleanor replied, her voice sharp and clinical. "The slow burn approach was your idea of mercy, David. But mercy is a luxury we can no longer afford. The creditors called again this morning. They aren't interested in the Miller legacy. They want the cash." Sarah felt the world tilt. She fumbled for her pocket, realizing she didn't have her phone to record this. But she found a small, battery-powered voice memo recorder she used for her interior design notes. She clicked it on, holding it to the vent. This was it. The smoking gun. The confession that would end this nightmare. She felt a surge of triumph, a momentary spark of hope that the law would protect her once she walked out that door with this recording. "We'll give her the final induction at the cabin," Eleanor said. "Double the chemical dosage in the next injection. It will look like a massive coronary brought on by the stress of the drive. Clean, irreproachable." Sarah held her breath, capturing every word. She had them. She just had to stay quiet, wait for them to leave the hallway, and then bolt for the window. She felt a sense of relief wash over her. She was the smart one, the one who had outplayed them. Then the vent rattled. A small, black puff of dust fell onto Sarah's shoulder. She looked up. Through the slats of the vent, she didn't see the dark emptiness of a duct. She saw a pair of pale blue eyes staring directly back at her. The vent wasn't just for air. It was a viewing port, a hidden vantage point Eleanor used to monitor the patient. The eyes vanished, followed by the sound of a heavy bolt sliding home, not on her door, but on the outside of the bathroom. "Sarah, darling." David's voice now came from right outside the bathroom door, loud and terrifyingly close. "You really shouldn't have listened. It only makes the transition more difficult for you." Sarah lunged for the door, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. They hadn't just caught her. They had lured her into the smallest, most inescapable room in the house. The safety of the bathroom was a pre-built trap. She looked down at the recorder in her hand. The little red light was blinking, a useless witness to her own interment. She wasn't the hunter, she was the specimen, and the walls were closing in. The transition from the house to the SUV was a blur of forced movement and whispered threats. David didn't use handcuffs. He used the weight of his hand on her shoulder and the cold promise of a psychiatric intervention if she screamed for the neighbors. He had already cleared her phone, her keys, and her purse. She was a ghost in her own driveway, being ushered into the back seat of the black Suburban like a prisoner of war. The interior of the car smelled of new leather and Eleanor's cloying perfume. It was a sterile, suffocating environment. as they pulled out of the manicured suburbs of Lake Forest. The identical beige houses with their welcome wreaths blurred into a single, mocking line. No one looked out their windows. No one saw the woman pressing her forehead against the glass, her fingers desperately rubbing a stone in her pocket. "We're doing this for your own good, Sarah," David said from the driver's seat, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. He began the sequence again. Thumb, index, middle. "The city is too loud. You need the silence of the woods." Eleanor sat in the back with Sarah, her presence a cold weight. She reached into a designer bag and pulled out a high-powered tactical flashlight. The beam was blinding, a white spear of light that cut through the cabin's gathering gloom. "Open up, dear," Eleanor commanded. "Time for your travel supplements." "I'm not taking anything," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. Eleanor didn't argue. She simply leaned over, her wiry strength pinning Sarah against the door. She jammed the flashlight under Sarah's chin, forcing her mouth open with a gloved hand. The light was so bright, Sarah could see the veins in her own eyelids. "Swallow," Eleanor hissed. Sarah felt the dry scratch of pills against her throat. She tried to hold them under her tongue, to wait for a moment to spit them out. But Eleanor's hand remained clamped over her mouth, her eyes watching Sarah's throat with the intensity of a hawk. Only when Sarah made the involuntary gulp of a defeated animal did Eleanor pull back, clicking the flashlight off. The darkness that followed was worse than the light. The sedative began to crawl through Sarah's veins like cold syrup. Her limbs grew heavy, her thoughts fragmenting like a broken mirror. She watched the highway signs fly past, milestones on the way to her own funeral. They drove for hours, ascending into the rugged terrain of the North Woods. The air outside grew thinner, the temperature dropping until frost began to bloom on the edges of the windows. When they finally turned onto the gravel path leading to the cabin, the tires crunched with a sound like breaking bones. The cabin was a jagged silhouette against the starless sky. It was a place of rest that looked like a tomb. As David hauled her out of the car, Sarah's feet dragged in the dirt. The smell of pine was overwhelming, a sharp, medicinal scent that offered no comfort. Inside, the cabin was freezing. David went straight to the wall, and Sarah heard the distinct snip-snip of wire cutters. He wasn't fixing anything. He was ensuring the landline was as dead as the surrounding forest. Eleanor began unpacking. She moved with a terrifying efficiency, laying out her brushes and soaps near the sink. Sarah, slumped in a moth-eaten armchair, watched as Eleanor opened a large, hard-shell suitcase. Resting on top, neatly pressed and wrapped in plastic, was a high-necked black silk dress. Sarah's breath hitched. It was the dress she had worn to her father's memorial. "It's a classic look," Eleanor remarked, smoothing the plastic with a rhythmic shh sound. "Stately. It will look very peaceful against the white satin of the lining." The confirmation was a physical blow. They weren't even hiding it anymore. The recovery trip was a live-action rehearsal for a wake. Morning brought no relief, only a cold, gray light that filtered through the towering pines. Sarah's head throbbed, the lingering effects of the sedative making her movements sluggish. She needed a moment, just one moment, away from their eyes. The opportunity came when David had to move the SUV to block the sun-rotted porch steps, and Eleanor was busy performing her 3-wash ritual at the kitchen sink. "I need some air," Sarah mumbled, heading for the door. "Don't go far, Sarah," Eleanor called out over the sound of rushing water. "Scrub, scrub, scrub." The woods are easy to get lost in. Sarah didn't answer. She stepped out into the biting cold, her lungs burning. She saw a chance. A rural gas station sat a quarter-mile down the road. She had seen it as they drove in. If she could reach the phone there, if she could find a human soul who wasn't a miller. She ran. Her boots slipped on the pine needles, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She reached the station, a rusted, peeling structure that smelled of ancient grease and spilled diesel. It looked abandoned, but a single light flickered inside. She rounded the corner of the building, heading for the outdoor payphone. But a shadow stepped out from behind a stack of weathered tires. It was Eleanor. She had moved with an impossible, predatory speed, cutting through the brush to intercept. In her hand, she clutched a sharpened gardening trowel, its metal edge glinting like a scalpel. "You've always been a runner, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. "Just like your father, always trying to escape the bill when it comes due." Eleanor lunged. The trowel whistled through the air, aimed at Sarah's temple. Sarah ducked, the metal biting into the rotted wood of the station wall just inches from her ear. The sound was a sharp thwack that vibrated through Sarah's skull. Desperation took over. Sarah's hand hit the ground, her fingers closing around a mound of coarse, jagged gravel. As Eleanor pulled the trowel free for a second strike, Sarah flung the stones with everything she had. Eleanor shrieked, her hands flying to her face as the grit found her eyes. She stumbled back, the trowel clattering to the asphalt. Sarah turned to bolt, her eyes fixed on the road, but a heavy hand slammed into her chest, knocking the wind from her lungs. David stood there, his face a mask of cold disappointment. He didn't look angry. He looked like a weary parent dealing with a difficult child. "That was very theatrical, Sarah," David said. He gripped her upper arm, his thumb digging into the bruise Eleanor had left the night before. "Help!" Sarah screamed, looking toward the station's glass front. A man sat behind the counter, staring at a blank television screen. He didn't turn. He didn't blink. He looked like a mannequin dressed in flannel. "He's a friend of the family, honey," David whispered, leaning close to her ear. "Everyone around here knows the Millers, and everyone knows you've been having a difficult mental break since the accident." He began to drag her back toward the car. Sarah fought, kicking at his shins, but the sedative was still a leaden weight in her blood. "If you scream again," David said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, melodic register, "I won't wait for the cabin. I'll call Dr. Harris right now. We'll have you committed to the state ward in the city. You know what happens to unstable women in those places, Sarah? They lose their voices entirely. At least at the cabin, you'll have the trees to listen to you." The threat was a cold blade to her throat. A psychiatric hold would strip her of every legal right she had left. She would be a prisoner in a white room instead of a wooden one. She stopped struggling. Her body went limp, a broken doll in his arms. David smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "That's my girl," he said. "Let's go finish our vacation." Back at the cabin, the atmosphere shifted from predatory to clinical. Sarah was confined to the bedroom, the door locked from the outside. She sat on the edge of the bed, her thumb moving in a frantic blur against the stone in her pocket. Scritch, scritch, scritch. She needed a weapon. She needed a plan. The sound of David and Eleanor arguing in the kitchen reached her. A low, rhythmic rumble. They were distracted. Sarah looked at the window. It was nailed shut, the glass reinforced with wire mesh. No exit there. But the wall shared a closet with the main living area. She pressed her ear to the wood, hearing the click of a latch. David's briefcase. He always kept it in the closet when they traveled. Using a heavy metal coat hanger, Sarah began to fish through the gap in the closet floorboards, a trick she had learned as a child in the drafty house her mother had been forced into. After several agonizing minutes, her hook snagged a leather strap. She pulled, the briefcase sliding toward her with a soft hiss across the wood. It wasn't locked. David's arrogance was his only weakness. She flipped the brass latches. Inside, beneath a layer of mundane firm memos, she found a thick, black-bound ledger. She opened it, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers. It wasn't a business record. It was a map of a sinking ship. The Miller firm, the pillar of the community, was a hollow shell. David had been funneling millions into offshore accounts to cover gambling debts that made her skin crawl. But the most terrifying detail was the names in the margins. Not banks, not investors. Names like Vito and the Butcher. The creditors weren't just demanding payment, they were demanding blood. Sarah realized then that she wasn't just worth $5 million dead. She was the collateral. Her life insurance was the only thing standing between David and a shallow grave in a Chicago construction site. The door handle rattled. Sarah shoved the ledger back into the briefcase and pushed it through the gap just as the bolt slid back. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face red from the gravel scratches, her eyes burning with a cold, medicinal light. "Time for your evening checkup, Sarah," she said, stepping into the room. She was holding a small glass vial. The liquid inside was a pale, sickly yellow. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Literally. Her chest felt tight, a fluttering sensation like a dying bird's wings. She recognized the label on the vial from her father's old medical texts. Digitalis purpurea, foxglove extract. In small doses, it helped the heart. In the doses Eleanor was measuring, it was a silent executioner. It was the source of the fog, the tremors, and the fainting spells. "I found this in your vanity, Eleanor," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady. She held up a smaller, empty vial she had snatched from the bathroom earlier. "I know what it is. I know what you're doing." Eleanor paused, her face settling into a mask of terrifying serenity. She didn't deny it. She didn't flinch. "Knowledge is a heavy burden for a sick woman, Sarah," Eleanor whispered. "It's a shame your heart is so weak. The stress of this discovery, it might just be the end of you." The final night at the cabin felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. A storm was rolling in, the wind howling through the pines with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. Sarah knew the accidental death deadline was tonight. The policy required a 48-hour waiting period after the trip began for the double indemnity clause to kick in. She saw her chance when David went to the shed to check the generator. The SUV sat in the driveway, its keys, she hoped, still in the ignition or the cup holder. She slipped out the kitchen door, the freezing wind biting into her skin. She reached the vehicle, her fingers fumbling with the handle. It was unlocked. She scrambled inside, her eyes searching the dark interior. No keys. She looked at the steering column. She had watched enough videos, read enough books during her long, lonely hours in the Lake Forest house. She grabbed a screwdriver from the glove box and began to pry at the plastic. Spark. Spark. The engine groaned, a mechanical cough that sounded like a death rattle in the silent woods. "Going somewhere, Sarah?" The voice came from the darkness of the back seat. David rose like a ghost, his hand reaching forward to wrap around her throat. He didn't squeeze, not yet. He just held her there, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You always were too smart for your own good," he whispered. He dragged her out of the car, her feet kicking uselessly against the gravel. He didn't use the front door. He hauled her through the mud, his grip on her hair so tight she felt her scalp begin to tear. Inside, the cabin was lit by the flickering orange glow of the fireplace. Eleanor stood by the kitchen table, her silver hair shimmering. She was holding a syringe, the long silver needle catching the firelight. David threw Sarah into a heavy wooden chair in the center of the room. He stepped behind her, pinning her arms to the backrest. "It's time, Mother," David said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Eleanor approached, her movements slow and deliberate. She tapped the side of the syringe, a tiny bead of yellow liquid appearing at the tip. "Do you want to know the truth, Sarah?" David asked, leaning down so his cheek was pressed against hers. "Before you go?" Sarah struggled, but the chair was bolted to the floor. She was a specimen on a board. "The accident 6 months ago?" David continued. "That wasn't a mechanical failure. I spent 3 hours in the garage, thinning the brake lines until they were the thickness of a human hair. I wanted it to be quick, I really did. But you were always so stubborn. You survived." Sarah felt a cold horror wash over her. The accident that had left her shattered and dependent on them hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a failed murder. "And now," David said, his hands tightening on her shoulders, "you're going to help us one last time. Your father's inheritance started this business. It's only fitting that your life ends it. The creditors will be paid. The Miller name will be clean. And you'll finally be at peace." Eleanor reached for Sarah's arm, her fingers searching for a vein. "Hold her still, David," Eleanor commanded. "I don't want to leave a bruise. It needs to look natural." Subverted beat 3.6. The needle hovered inches from Sarah's skin. She could see the tiny, wicked point of the steel, the pale yellow poison shimmering inside the glass barrel. This was the moment in the stories where the hero found a hidden strength, where the floorboards gave way, where a neighbor knocked on the door. Sarah looked into David's eyes, searching for a flicker of the man she had married, a spark of the love they had shared in the early days in Seattle. "David, please," she wheezed, her voice a broken reed. "You don't have to do this. We can go to the police together. We can tell them Eleanor forced you. I'll forgive you. Just don't let her do this." David's expression softened. His grip on her arms loosened just a fraction. He looked at Eleanor, then back at Sarah. A single tear tracked down his cheek. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. "I really am." He reached out and took the syringe from Eleanor's hand. "I'll do it," David said. "She should be with someone who loved her when it happens. Go to the other room, Mother. Let me give her this much." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, her face a mask of clinical approval. She turned and walked toward the bedroom, the rhythmic clack-clack of her heels fading. Sarah felt a surge of hope so intense it made her dizzy. David was going to save her. He was going to squirt the poison into the floorboards, help her to the car, and they would disappear. He was still her David. The logic was sound. He was a victim of his mother's ambition, a man caught in a trap he never wanted. "Thank you," Sarah sobbed, her body sagging with relief. "Thank you, David." David leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. He adjusted the syringe, his thumb resting on the plunger. "You're right, Sarah," he whispered. "I don't want to let her do this." He didn't move toward the floor. He didn't look for the exit. He plunged the needle deep into Sarah's thigh, his face twisting into a mask of pure, calculated greed. "I don't want her to do it," David hissed, his voice a venomous rasp. "Because I want to be the one to see the light go out. I want to be the one who knows for sure that the 5 million is mine. She would have found a way to cut me out. But this is between us. He slammed the plunger down. Sarah's world didn't explode. It didn't go black. Instead, a searing, icy fire began to spread from her leg. A slow-motion paralysis that felt like her blood was turning to slush. She realized with a crushing, final horror that David wasn't the reluctant accomplice. He was the monster. He had used her hope as a distraction to ensure he was the sole executioner. He didn't pull the needle out. He left it hanging from her skin, a silver trophy of his betrayal. "The deadline just passed, Sarah," David said, checking his platinum watch with a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. "Midnight. The policy's active. You're worth more to me now than you ever were alive." He stood up, smoothing his silk shirt, and walked toward the kitchen to pour himself a glass of wine. Sarah was left alone in the chair, the firelight dancing in her fading vision, the poison beginning its slow, rhythmic march toward her heart. She wasn't saved. She was a completed transaction. The fire in her veins was a cold, numbing weight. But Sarah's mind, honed by years of cataloging the minute details of her domestic cage, refused to spark out. She watched David through the haze, his back turned as he sipped the vintage red. He thought the game was over. He thought the week had finally been harvested. Sarah reached into her pocket. Her fingers, stiff and heavy, found the drafting compass she had tucked away while searching the office days ago. It was a small, sharp tool, meant for precision. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She waited. As David leaned over to stoke the fire, his hand resting on the stone hearth, Sarah lunged with the last of her strength. She didn't aim for his heart. She aimed for the hand that had held the needle. The compass point sank deep into David's palm. He let out a sharp, guttural cry, his wine glass shattering on the floor. In the chaos of his shock, Sarah's hand swept across the counter, finding the small tray of supplements Eleanor had left out. She saw the vial of Eleanor's own heart medication, a powerful sedative meant to keep the older woman's blood pressure in check. With a speed born of pure survival, Sarah swapped the empty syringe in her leg for a fresh one Eleanor had left on the tray, drawing up the sedative. As David turned, his face contorted in rage, Sarah didn't run. She struck. She jammed the needle into David's arm, slamming the plunger home before he could throw her off. What did you—" David stumbled, his words slurring. The high-dose sedative hit his system like a physical blow. Eleanor burst into the room, her face a mask of fury. "David, what are you doing?" Sarah didn't wait to explain. She scrambled toward the cellar door, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She grabbed the heavy iron bar leaning against the wall, the one David had meant to use on her, and slammed it across the cellar door just as Eleanor tried to charge through. The sound of the bar sliding into place was the most beautiful music Sarah had ever heard. "Let us out!" Eleanor shrieked from behind the wood, her voice muffled by the thick oak. "Sarah, you're a sick woman. You need us." Sarah didn't look back. She stumbled out into the night, the freezing wind a benediction. She ran. 3 miles of jagged terrain, her heart fluttering and jumping in her chest like a dying engine. She followed the low, mournful humming she heard in the distance, a sound that should have been terrifying, but felt like a lighthouse. She reached the ranger station, a small lit building at the edge of the state park. Officer James Taylor was there, his flannel shirt smelling of pine and old coffee. He didn't ask for her insurance policy. He didn't check her pulse with a cold, calculating eye. He just wrapped her in a heavy wool blanket and picked up the radio. The trial in Lake Forest was the scandal of the decade. The Miller legacy was stripped bare. revealed as a rot-filled structure of debt and deceit. Sarah sat in the witness stand, her voice steady, her posture no longer rigid with fear, but with the hard-won strength of a survivor. She watched as Eleanor was led away in handcuffs, her silver hair finally coming loose from its tight bun. But the final twist came during the discovery phase of the trial. The forensic team had analyzed the supplements found in the cabin. They discovered that Eleanor hadn't just been poisoning Sarah. She had been administering microdoses of the same toxin to David for years. She hadn't been helping her son. She had been preparing him. Once Sarah was dead and the insurance was paid, David would have been the next accidental tragedy, leaving Eleanor as the sole, undisputed matriarch of the Miller fortune. David sat in the defendant's chair, his face a pale, hollow mask. He looked at his mother, and for the first time, the control freak saw the cage he had lived in his entire life. He hadn't been the architect. He had been the next crop. Months later, the air in Seattle was cool and damp, smelling of salt and possibilities. Sarah stood on the balcony of her new apartment, looking out at the gray expanse of the Pacific. Her health was returning. The fog lifted to reveal a world that was sharp, clear, and hers. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the river stone. It was worn thin now, a small, smooth sliver of her past. She didn't rub it 10 times. She didn't wait for a chill to leave the room. She simply opened her hand and let it fall, watching as it disappeared into the dark water below. The house in Lake Forest was gone. The Millers were gone. But Sarah Miller was finally, for the first time in her life, exactly where she was supposed to be. She turned and went inside, closing the door behind her. The click of the lock didn't sound like a trap. It sounded like peace. The end.